Hey, let's talk about the vocabulary of resistance. It's me, Moser, and after this video, you should be able to identify some of the basic terms associated with antibiotic resistance and correctly recall their definitions. You don't really need to know anything going in. We're kind of going to start from the ground floor. And that means we're going to start with bacteria themselves. So you probably already know that bacteria are single-celled organisms. They are living things. They're able to reproduce. They're able to make their own proteins. They kind of have a life going on. Doesn't look like much of a life to us, but we've got a kind of a basic generic bacteria here. And even the simplest bacteria has a plasma membrane or a cell membrane. It's the inner layer that kind of keeps the stuff on the inside and stuff on the outside. And bacteria also have a cell wall. It's just another layer of protection. Some of them are even so fancy, they have what's called a capsule. It's kind of like, if you think back to our discussion of viruses, the fact that some viruses have an extra layer of protection. Some bacteria have an extra layer of protection. Some bacteria have a little tail-looking thing. It looks like a whip. It's called a flagella. And some, well, all of them actually, have ribosomes. Ribosomes are those little factories where proteins are assembled. And most importantly, all bacteria have DNA. And that's what they use to pass on their genetic information to their offspring. Bacteria actually come in a number of shapes, though they're all microscopic. We'll talk more about the different shapes and different kinds of bacteria you might see later. If we're going to talk about antibiotic resistance, I suppose we should probably talk about what an antibiotic is. Well, let's start off with some common misconceptions about what antibiotics aren't. Aspirin is not an antibiotic. Advil is not an antibiotic. NyQuil, still not an antibiotic. Prednisone, a steroid, not an antibiotic. So what are antibiotics? Well, things like vancomycin, doxycycline, piperacillin, and amoxicillin. And antibiotics can come in pill form, they can come in an injectable or intravenous form, and they can come in a liquid form, very often given to little kids who can't swallow pills. When you were looking up your vocabulary, you should have seen that there were a couple of prefixes and roots in the word antibiotic itself. Anti means against, and bio means life. Well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound very good. Antibiotics are drugs that kill bacterial pathogens. Remember, bacterial pathogens are living things. Antibiotics don't work against non-living pathogens. So let's look at the word homeostasis. I know this is in a slightly different order than you have them on your slides, but that's okay. If you did a little bit of prefix and root work, you found that homeo means similar to. Now, you might not have found that, but you might have thought that homeo sounded an awful lot like homo, which means same. And if you looked up stasis, you may have found that stasis refers to something that's standing still. Homeostasis refers to the stable conditions that all living things need. That is, stable on the inside. So let's duck back to our little friend, the bacteria, for a moment. Do bacteria require stable conditions inside their little single cell? You betcha. So now let's talk about what living things want in general. We know that living things need stable conditions, and there are generally two conditions that we're actually talking about. The first one is temperature. Living things, any living thing, from a bacteria to a blue whale, a fern to you, to a dandelion, to an earthworm, to an ant, requires a relatively stable temperature on the inside of their body. Too hot, they die. Too cold, they die. The other thing that living things need to have relatively stable is their water balance. Imagine filling a water balloon and then, oops, overfilling the water balloon. Well, that's not good. A living thing has to have enough water inside its cells to keep them the right size and shape. If too much water ends up in their cells, well, they pop. If too little water ends up inside their cells, well, they turn into jerky. Ew. As far as controlling temperature goes, beautiful multicellular organisms like you have ways to do that. If you're too cold, you shiver. If you're too hot, you sweat, and as that sweat evaporates, it cools you off. This also helps maintain your water balance. But what about bacteria? Oh, well, our little friends, the bacteria, can't do anything about their temperatures. No shivering and no sweating. They can pump water in and out of their cells, but, they don't have a whole lot to work with here. So again, homeostasis are those stable conditions that all living things need on the inside. And some living things, like I said, fabulous multicellular organisms such as yourself, have ways to control those internal conditions. Some living things, like bacteria, are a little bit more at the mercy of their environment, but we'll talk more about that as we go. Population may be the most frequently misunderstood word on this vocabulary set, because here is what population is not. It's not the number of individuals living in a place. That's the population size. In a biological sense, when we talk about population, it's all the field mice living in a particular field, or all the bluegill living in a particular lake, or all the silver maple trees living in a particular woodlot, or all the bacteria living in a particular human gut, or skin, human body. That's a population. So when we use the word population in ecology, and we are actually going to start to use it in the ecological sense here, it means all the organisms of one single species that are living together in a specific place and trading genes. Now, usually trading genes means, mating. It gets a little complicated with bacteria, but we'll get there. Well, now we come to variation, and you probably know what a variety pack is. If you get a variety pack of macaroni and cheese, you might have 4 different flavors. If you get a variety pack of gum, you got a bunch of different flavors. Variety means difference, and variation is just the way that biologists refer to differences in members of a population. Oh, yeah, we had to know what that meant first. Sometimes those differences are visible to the naked eye. Sometimes they're not. Here we've got a population of Asian ladybird beetles. And we can see that there are different shades of red and orange. They have different numbers of spots. There might even be a few sneaky little other species in there. But there's variation in the population that we can see with the naked eye. Here's a population of human beings, and we can see variations in height and coloration and hair color and all sorts of things like that with the naked eye. What we can't see are variations that exist at a cellular level. Maybe some of these people have allergies that others don't. Maybe some of them lack the enzyme that allow them to drink milk without having horrible discomfort. Maybe some of them have type O blood, and some of them have type A blood. Those are all differences, variations, that we can't see with the naked eye. In animal species, we often see fur color, again, as a piece of the variation that we see with the naked eye. But, just like in our last example, there may be differences that exist in the individuals of this population that we can't see with the naked eye. Heck! Sometimes we have a population of organisms that we can't even see with the naked eye, like, this bacteria here. It's awful purty. Well, this bacteria can't be seen with the naked eye, and there may in fact be differences between members of the population of this species of bacteria. Possibly a species of bacteria living in your gut, or in the soil outside your home, or on the skin of your dog, underneath their fur. But if we look at the whole population of that species living in that one particular place, we'd surely find some kind of variation. That's going to become really important later on. Mutations. This is probably one for which you found no obvious root or prefix or suffix, though you've probably heard of mutants, and you probably think you know what a mutant is. Maybe some crazy looking thing with, glowing red eyes and horns coming out of its face, and who knows. Well, I hate to tell you, but mutation is not nearly as exciting as that. A mutation is just a change in genetic material, and that could be DNA or RNA. Mutations happen because of mistakes in copying genetic material. There's DNA and it gets copied all the time. We're going to talk a whole lot about that a little bit down the road. But it gets copied, RNA gets copied. These materials, they go through lots of stages and lots of changes and lots of copying. And if you've ever tried to copy something, you know that sometimes you don't get it exactly right. Ta-da! I did it! It's not quite like the original though, is it? That's a mutation. And why are we talking about mutation in this context? Well, guess where some of that variation came from? Oh, mutations happen in any population. They're just sort of a random chance fact of life. And when they do, sometimes the effects are visible on the outside. That's that visible variation. Sometimes the effects are not visible on the outside. Those are mutations that we can't necessarily see, but they exist nonetheless, and those mutations make us all increasingly different. That's actually a good thing. We'll talk more about that later. Natural selection is a term that you've probably heard, and you know what it means if something's natural, it happens in nature, and you know what it means to select something. But you've probably most often heard this referred to as survival of the fittest. Here's what we don't mean by that. We don't mean the person who can pedal a bike the fastest or lift the most weight or anything else silly like that. Survival of the fittest means the fittest are the organisms that are the best fit for their particular environment. Whether that environment is the bottom of a fast-moving mountain stream somewhere in southeast Ohio, or the saguaro cactus deserts of southern Arizona, or a mountain in China where there's a whole lot of bamboo and not a whole lot of anything else, or an acid environment such as that's found inside the human gut. Ooh, I keep talking about bacteria in your gut. Really? Yeah, really. So the organisms that are the best fit for that environment tend to survive. Natural selection is actually how evolution happens. It's the mechanism. It means that predators are least likely to catch the most alert prey with the best hearing and the best camouflage and the longest legs and the speediest getaway. It's the mechanism of how evolution works. Natural selection is a term that you've probably heard, and you know what it means if something's natural, it happens in nature, and you know what it means to select something. But you've probably most often heard this referred to as survival of the fittest. Here's what we don't mean by that. We don't mean the person who can pedal a bike the fastest or lift the most weight or anything else silly like that. Survival of the fittest means the fittest are the organisms that are the best fit for their particular environment. Whether that environment is the bottom of a fast-moving mountain stream somewhere in southeast Ohio, or the saguaro cactus deserts of southern Arizona, or a mountain in China where there's a whole lot of bamboo and not a whole lot of anything else, or an acid environment such as that's found inside the human gut. Ooh, I keep talking about bacteria in your gut. Really? Yeah, really. So the organisms that are the best fit for that environment tend to survive. Natural selection is actually how evolution happens. It's the mechanism. It means that predators are least likely to catch the most alert prey with the best hearing and the best camouflage and the longest legs and the speediest getaway. It's the mechanism of how evolution works. This brings us to our last vocabulary word, resistant. And again, you might not have found a great root or prefix or suffix, but you probably know the word resist. Can you resist the temptation of that box of donuts? I can. Resistant, you're familiar with probably mostly in terms of things like water-resistant materials. Maybe you have a water-resistant jacket, or your phone is supposedly water-resistant. I'm not going to test that. Well, to be resistant means to be able to withstand something without being harmed. A water-resistant phone can stand getting water on it, and it doesn't harm the phone. Of course, we're interested in the concept of resistant in terms of bacteria. So what if we have a population of bacteria and we treat them with an antibiotic? Here's our amoxicillin. And what if, as we do that, some of them start to die? Well, that's good. That's what we want. But the problem is, what if not all of them die? What if, in fact, when we keep treating them with bacteria, though many of them die, some of them do just fine. Thank you very much. So these bacteria that are able to withstand exposure to this antibiotic without being harmed, we would say are resistant to the antibiotic. And that is a bad thing, which, of course, as you're tired of hearing by now, we'll talk more about later.